The Metropolitan Police, this is really interesting. If we go back to 1918, 1919, this is I did my university dissertation on the police strikes of 1918 to 1919. Before then, before 1918, the state made a big, big mistake, a big error, because they didn't pay the Met Police properly. And so in that period, the Met Police Force and other police forces across the country were paid a derisory sum of money. They often went hungry and they did more than one job. And that's because at the same time, during the war, you got other workers organizing through trade unions in order to improve their wages and terms and conditions, often with success, and before the World War I, but the police were banned from doing so. So then the National Union of Prison Police Officers were set up, and in 1918, the Metropolitan Police went on strike en masse. The whole police force went on strike. And that caused panic amongst the state, because this was not long after the Russian Revolution. There were strikes and insurgencies taking place across the country. The army was mutinying after World War I. There were huge mutinies taking place. And they thought to themselves, oh, my word, if the Metropolitan Police goes on strike, then we have no means to suppress these other rebellions, or, we could be overwhelmed by revolution. And so what happened as a consequence is the Police Federation was set up as a top-down kind of bosses union. The National Union of Prison and Police Officers was banned. They went on strike against that again in 1919, some police officers, most famously in Liverpool, and they were all kicked out of the police force. Some of them were near to their pensions. They were old. They had their pensions scrapped and were suffered terrible hardship as a consequence. And the state didn't make the same mistake again. So they paid the police higher wages than many other workers and improved their terms and conditions. And during the general strike of 1926, the Metropolitan Police returned the favour by organising to help suppress the general strike of 1926. Now, again, in the 1970s, you saw police salaries didn't go down to where they were before. But Margaret Thatcher, unlike other public sector workers, she hiked the salaries of the police force, ensuring, of course, their loyalty. Now, in terms of other examples of grievous wrongdoing, let's think about Blair Peach. Blair Peach was a New Zealand teacher, an anti-fascist, an anti-racist, who was killed at an anti-racism demonstration in London in 1979. An investigation later found he'd been killed by a member of the Special Patrol Group. Other officers obstructed the investigation with a conspiracy of silence. This, of course, is a recurring theme in the history of the Metropolitan Police Force. Let's talk, of course, about Stephen Lawrence. Stephen Lawrence, a young black teenager who was murdered. The Metropolitan Police catastrophically mishandled the murder investigation. There was alleged corruption with allegations. The father of one of the killers paid one of the chief investigators. These were allegations. And then the police sent an undercover officer to spy on the Justice campaign led by his parents. Now, again, the Metropolitan Police here were found by an inquiry to be institutionally racist. Let's talk about undercover police officers. I've interviewed several women who had relationships with undercover police officers who had fake identities and made up who they were. Some of them were together for years. One of them at least had a child. Here's an example of one, Mark Kennedy. Mark Kennedy pretended to be a left-wing activist, infiltrated these groups, had a relationship with a woman. Again, I mean, one of those women said it was like being raped by the state. We talked here about the murder of Daniel Morgan, a private investigator killed with an axe in a pub car park. And again, inquiry found the Metropolitan Police was guilty of institutional corruption in its concealing and denials in the failures of their investigations. Let's talk about John Charles de Menezes, a Brazilian electrician. And this is such a striking case. Such a striking case. And a Brazilian electrician. Now, this was not long after 7/7, in which suicide bombers detonated themselves on the London Underground, killing dozens of people. And there was another abortive suicide attack. There was a manhunt for the suspects. De Menezes, who was on his way, by the way, to fix a broken fire alarm on the other side of London, he looked nothing like any of those suspects. Nothing. But the plainclothes officers decided otherwise. They followed him as he calmly picked up a free paper at Stockwell Station, used his Oyster card, got on a train, and then was shot in the head 7 times in front of passengers who were clearly horrified and terrified, shot on the head 7 times. The Met then waged a dirty campaign against this innocent man, this innocent Brazilian electrician who they killed. They claimed he was a terror suspect. No, he wasn't. That he'd vaulted the barrier. No, he didn't. Lots of people still think this, by the way. I bet some of you, that's the first time you heard that he didn't jump the barrier. Some people thought he was terrified by being followed by the Metropolitan Police, and therefore, that was somehow led to the events of being shot. He didn't vault the barrier at all. That he was high on drugs. No, he wasn't. That he'd acted aggressively. No, he hadn't. They issued a picture showing to try and show he did look a bit like one of the suspects. They altered the image to make it look like he did. Who was in charge of the operation? Cressida Dick. Lies after lies after lies after lies. Ian Tomlinson. I'm going to bring this up, this disgusting splash from the Evening Standard. Police pelted with bricks as they helped dying man. Heart attack victim found in alleyway. Riot officers clear out city camp. Yeah, this was, again, and this shows often how the media work hand in hand. Too much of the media work hand in hand. They did this over Hillsborough, of course, with the Sun, defaming the dead and the traumatized survivors of Hillsborough. Ian Tomlinson was a homeless vendor. He wasn't part of the protest taking place at the time against G20. And he was walking, and then he was just whacked by a police officer for nothing and fell to the ground. He died. An inquest found it was an unlawful killing. But what the police did is disseminate a load of lies that he'd had a heart attack and the police tried to help him, but they were being pelted with bricks by those protesters around. Now, it should be clear that a jury later cleared the police officer involved. An inquest found it was an unlawful killing. The fact the Met Police institutionally just tried to lie, waged, again, lie after lie. And the only reason these lies were found to be lies was because video footage came out which showed exactly what actually happened. We can talk about the fact that Black Londoners are not only several times more likely to be stopped and searched on suspicion of possessing drugs, but several times more likely to be charged as well. Let's talk about the homophobia, which I've mentioned. Stephen Paul. Now, MPs, several of them demanded the Met Police have an inquiry into institutional homophobia, which, again, relatives of those who were killed. This was the so-called grinder killer. He drugged gay men and raped them and left their dead bodies in a churchyard. And the police failed, and the allegations are because the police just thought this was a kind of lifestyle consequence of gay men. Let's talk about the fact that in the past 4 years, 2,000 officers have been accused of misconduct for the last 4 years, including sexual assault, rape, child sex offenders. But just 1/3 of guilty workers have been sacked in cases where misconduct complaints have been upheld. Of course, again, notoriously, the fact that the police attacked the vigil of Sarah Everard, compare and contrast their treatment of the vigil to the partying in Number 10. And that was, of course, after Sarah Everard had been murdered by a serving Metropolitan Police Force who used the powers granted to the police under lockdown measures. What of Nicole Smallman and Bibba Henry? Nicole Smallman, Bibba Henry, 2 black sisters who went missing and who were murdered, which the Independent Office for Police Conduct condemned the Met for failing the family, who found the 2 women after organising their own search party, and they failed to follow procedure. 2 of their own officers, of course, took pictures of dead bodies to share. Now, we could go on. This is an institutional problem